So, I am very pleased to have John Rosemond with me. He's a parenting and family psychologist based in North Carolina, except he's not a big fan of psychology. He thinks it's done a lot more damage than it's ever helped anybody. And, John, is that a pretty accurate intro of you?
Yeah, I think that is. In addition, I'm a syndicated columnist and author of about 20 books and a public speaker, but you've represented my position on psychology fairly accurately. We can elaborate on it if you'd like.
That's good. I mean, I already know your views, but for the sake of some of my listeners, if you wouldn't mind just briefly telling what you don't like about psychology, why you think it's so damaging, and the damage that it's done.
And I'm talking about clinical psychology, which I do not believe is a science, and it's not based on science. It is based on bogus theories concerning human nature, none of which have been proven correct, and most of which have been proven incorrect. For example, Freudian theory has been completely disproven, and yet, amazingly enough, Nick, it is still taught in America's psychology graduate programs. This is the equivalent of still teaching to medical students Aristotle's 5 humors of how the body works. I mean, it's absurd. We began listening to psychologists tell us how to raise children about 50 years ago. And since that time, the mental health of the American child has tanked.
Give me some
parenting.
So when it comes to parenting, what exactly was the bad advice given out by psychologists?
That high self-esteem is a good thing, that behavior modification is the answer to all discipline problems, and none of this has panned out at all. And I believe this is a factual statement, that psychology, although it pretends to be based on science, is actually an ideology. It's a secular ideology that has not lived up to its promise at all.
Okay. Well, let's move right along, and I wanted to talk about one thing that you just mentioned, and that was self-esteem. I understand you're not a fan of raising children with high self-esteem. It doesn't makes them arrogant. It doesn't make them think of others very well. Do you believe that low self-esteem can be just as damaging as high self-esteem? Because I happen to believe that.
Well, the opposite of high self-esteem historically and traditionally is not low self-esteem. The opposite of high self-esteem is humility. Now, interestingly enough, the research into self-esteem has pretty well demonstrated that people who think highly of themselves are also highly prone to periodic episodes of deep depression. And predominantly, the explanation is that the world simply fails to confirm their inflated impression of who they are. And when it does fail to confirm that, many of these people retreat into depression. And so high self-esteem, and again, nothing psychology has promised over the last 50 years has lived up to its promises. High self-esteem, one author said, high self-esteem is the secret to a child's success in every area of life. That was Dorothy Briggs writing in her best-selling book, Your Child's Self-Esteem, published in 1970. Well, now we know that people with high self-esteem underperform. They are not successful people. They believe that anything they do is worthy of merit. And when you believe that anything you do is worthy of merit, because this is what you've been told in America's public school system, then you don't do your best, you don't try your hardest, you tend to, again, underperform, which is the finding.
So that's what happens when you, as I like to say, you praise a child just for breathing oxygen. They start to think that breathing oxygen is something that's worthy of some kind of a reward.
Yeah, I mean, when I was in school, and I contrast a lot of this with the sort of psychological, if you will, atmosphere that I grew up in which you really had to do something that was outstanding in order to receive praise. If you didn't do something outstanding, if you only did what was expected of you, you were not praised for that. And now kids, and since the late 60s, early 1970s, kids have been getting praise in school, for example, for writing their name properly at the top of the page. And to people my age, I turned 70 on November the 25th of this year. Thank you very much. To people of my age, this is absurd. And furthermore, to people my age, we understand that proper parenting is essential to the strength of a culture. As a culture's parenting practices weaken, the culture weakens. And this is what's concerning to people in my generation, is that we see a generation that, and of course, Nick, there are exceptions to everything that I say. I have to speak in generalities. But we see a generation that is absorbed in themselves. They are absorbed in their technologies, their cell phones, smartphones primarily. And this is not a highly motivated generation, according to employers around the country. And we see a generation that isn't willing to defend the ideals that have characterized America since its founding nearly 250 years ago. And that's of great concern to us, because undoubtedly this is the greatest country that's ever existed on the face of the earth.
And what specifically is it? What ideals are not being defended by this generation, as you see it, John?
The work ethic, loyalty, respect for others, humility, an understanding of America's greatness in history, and an understanding that we are a very unique country, and the uniqueness of this country has been a beacon to people all over the world for 200 years, and we need to maintain that. And the world needs for us to maintain it, because if we're gone, there is no other nation on the face of the earth that is willing to step in and defend democracy like we have defended it for 250 years.
Okay, so you've started to answer another question that I wanted to get into, but I'd like you to elaborate a little bit more. When it comes to behavior of children today and psychological parenting, how much worse is it today than when you grew up? What behaviors of children are you seeing today that you never saw when you were a kid?
Tantrums in public places.
You never saw that growing up?
No, there is every indication, Nick, that, and of course we're relying tremendously on anecdotal information, because there wasn't a lot of field research being done in parenting until about 1955, when Harvard and Stanford and Yale teamed together and did a survey of American child rearing. But there is every indication that in the 1950s and before, tantrums on the part of a child were over completely by age 3. Defiance was over completely by age 3. 1955, Harvard University, along with Stanford, Yale, Princeton, discovered that 90% of children in America aged 23 months were completely toilet trained. They were accident free. And now we see children walking around with, I call them little depends, when they're 4 years old. This is absurd. And this is a consequence, not of bad parenting. It is a consequence of America's parents listening to people with capital letters after their names, tell them to do something that no one needed experts to tell them how to do before this time. An ironic thing for me to say because I'm regarded as an expert.
Right. I'm sorry. You did cut out just a little bit right there, but I think I heard the essence of what you were saying, that people started deciding, well, if someone has capital letters in front of their name, they're called an expert, and they must know what they're talking about.
Precisely. The expert in parenting in the 1950s and before was an elder in your extended family, an elder in your church, an elder in your neighborhood, someone who had obviously done a good job of raising kids, someone that you could trust. And these are the people that America's parents were going to. And then with the help of the media in the 1960s, the mental health professions sold the idea to America that when it came to the raising of children, they were the go-to people.
I understood. So now I want to change gears a little bit, and I want to talk about one thing you wrote that probably the pivotal thing that I disagree with you on. So maybe you can explain it to me, and I'll understand it a little bit better. I know you're very adamant that parents should not try and be friends with their children, and you need to be their parents, you need to take charge of them. That I understand. However, I'm aware, John, that you go even further, and you say that parents should not even try and develop close relationships with their children. And that, I admit, is something I'd never heard before. So if I've misunderstood you in any way, or if you can explain it to me, please do so.
Okay, well, I'm saying this, that children need two primary qualities from the important adults in their lives. They need unconditional love, and they need unequivocal authority. One without the other becomes toxic very quickly.
Yeah.
Love without authority becomes enabling, becomes codependence. Authority without love becomes abuse. And you've got to keep these two qualities in a state of reasonable balance. When parents put relationship in front of leadership, they are unable to provide proper leadership. You cannot, if you are in a leadership position, attempt to form relationships with the people that strong, intimate relationships with the people that you are charged with leading. You have to maintain a boundary. And a lot of America's parents today, Nick, are not maintaining that boundary. It's an emotional boundary as well as a physical boundary.
And why is that boundary so necessary in order to maintain authority?
It's necessary to maintain authority in any context where leadership is being provided by one person to another person or group of people. Maintaining an emotional and physical boundary in that context, wherever you find it, is absolutely essential. And what I further say, Nick, is that if you put leadership first, proper relationship will follow in its own time. You should be, as a parent, not primarily in relationship with your children. You should be primarily providing leadership to your children. If you provide proper leadership, the relationship will develop, and it will develop properly as it should, according to its own season, if you will.
So you say if you prioritize leadership, relationship will naturally follow. But if you prioritize relationship, you can never have leadership.
If you prioritize relationship, you shoot yourself in the foot when it comes to your ability to provide leadership, yes.
Now, are you referring to parents who won't make proper rules because they don't want their child to dislike them? Is that what you're referring to?
I am referring in part to parents who are afraid to make their children upset. And so they never make decisions, they never make proper decisions because they are afraid to make their children upset with them. And I hear this from parents. I travel the country and talk, Nick, on an annual basis with, I am sure, more parents about parenting issues than any other person in this country. And I have been doing that for at least the last 35 to 40 years. And I hear parents tell me they don't want to make their children upset because they are afraid of disrupting the relationship that they are trying to maintain. And it's a prime example of exactly what I just said. When you try for relationship first, you're unable to provide proper leadership. When you provide proper leadership, you will have ultimately a wonderful relationship, but that can't be your priority. The horse is leadership, the cart is relationship.
That I understand. So when you talk about the real strong importance of emotional and physical boundaries between parent and child, what do those boundaries look like exactly? Describe in detail, if you don't mind.
Well, the emotional boundary is, codependence. Let me approach it this way, Nick.
Okay.
Codependence is feeling another person's pain. Codependence is the lack of an emotional boundary between one person and another. When you feel another person's pain, you become an enabler. That is different from understanding that another person is in pain. That is different from empathy. So an emotional boundary between parent and child, which you really can't establish until the child is 3.5.
When they're out of diapers and they're going.
Yeah, out of diapers, they're able to do most things for themselves. They're reasonably independent. They're to a reasonable degree standing on their own 2 feet, solving their own problems, or at least capable of it. About that time, you need to begin establishing and maintaining an emotional boundary between yourself and your child. And, part of that involves the child coming to you and emoting about something, and I use the word triaging. You triage the child's emotions. You say to the child, your emotion in this particular situation, or words to this effect, your emotion in this particular situation is out of proportion to what has happened. I am not going to participate in it. I am not going to acknowledge it. You need to deal with it independently, and I forbid you from disrupting this family with that particular emotional expression. Now, you wouldn't use those words with a 3.5-year-old.
But that would be the gist.
But that would be the message. One of the things that's happened here when we started listening to psychologists, psychology turned into this feeling-based ideology in the 1960s. And one of the memes, the parenting memes, Nick, that came out of the 1960s, I was there, and I believed all this stuff. And I swallowed this stuff hook, line, and sinker when I was in graduate school. One of the memes that came out of the 1960s was, children have a right to express their feelings freely. Well, no, they don't. Nobody has a right to express their feelings freely. Feelings can be very, very destructive, damaging things. You have no right as a human being, with respect for other people, to express anything that you feel at any given moment in time. And a well-socialized person keeps most of his or her emotional reactions to everything in a good state of check, as a matter of fact. One of the things that I'm seeing now on the part of children, and I believe it is directly related to the manufacturing of this children have a right to express their feelings meme in the 1960s is children who cannot control their emotions. And now we're calling this bipolar disorder of childhood, which is a complete and utter crock. All of this is a matter of training. I was in a Starbucks the other day. The girl had to be 10 years old. She was jumping up and down, shrieking, screaming at the top of her lungs because her father wasn't getting her what she wanted. And this is unbelievable that kids this age are doing stuff like this all over America. And Nick, I can't stress enough, this is the consequence of us listening to mental health professionals tell us how to raise kids.
And you believe that this meme of children have a right to freely express their feelings, that's partially a consequence of the codependency and as parents being unwilling to upset their children?
Absolutely.
Okay. I want to stay on that topic for just a little bit of the parent-child relationship when it comes to boundaries. I know you said in the column at one point, there's nothing wrong with a parent and a child playing catch in the backyard occasionally, but it should only be occasionally. Do you still stand by that comment?
Yeah, I don't think that parents should be their children's playmates is the point I was making. I don't think that the father should feel that he is obligated when he comes home from work, or the mother, to get down on the floor and play with the kids to make up for the fact that he hasn't seen his children all day. I believe, and this is part of the physical and emotional boundary that you establish, and this is part of the